I always believed a family trip could stitch together the distance between us. Yet the moment I stepped into the departure hall that morning, I realized my hope was far more fragile than I wanted to admit. My name is Fallon Gray, 26 years old, and I had prepared every part of our 5-day getaway at Amangiri in the Colorado Plateau with the quiet intention of giving my parents a sense of being appreciated, even though I had spent most of my life standing in the shadow of their favoritism. Everything shattered in a single breath at the check-in counter. My mom, Debbie, yanked my suitcase from my hand and slammed it onto the floor in front of the long line of passengers watching from only a few steps away. She stared straight at me and delivered each word with the sharpness of a blade. This is the result of raising your brother into success, and you are nothing but a parasite. Get out. The air fell still for a moment, yet the contempt in her eyes never flickered. If you want to know what happened the moment they landed and why that single sentence ended up costing them far more than they ever expected, stay until the end. This story is for anyone who has ever been pushed aside by the very people they tried their best to lift up. Make sure to follow the series and subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. My dad, Jensen, stood beside her but looked away, as if my existence alone embarrassed him. I did not respond. I knew that anything I said would only fuel the script my mom had already prepared for the audience around us. What they did not know was that every detail of this trip, from the suite to the private transfers, had been paid for by me. I never asked for gratitude, nor did I demand acknowledgement. Yet the moment my suitcase lay on the cold tile, I understood that silence was no longer the safest choice. So I let them walk toward the gate first, believing I would follow. I stayed behind, unlocked my phone, and made the calmest decision of my life. I canceled their entire trip. If you want to know what happened the moment they landed and why that single sentence ended up costing them far more than they ever expected, stay until the end. This story is for anyone who has ever been pushed aside by the very people they tried their best to lift up. Make sure to follow the series and subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Time has a way of exposing patterns long before we understand them, and in my family, those patterns were carved into everyday life. I learned early that my brother Travis held the center of my parents' world, and even the smallest achievement of his seemed to glow with a kind of brilliance they never directed toward me. When he brought home a high exam score or received praise from a teacher, the house filled with excitement, and Mom treated the moment like a sign of his destined greatness. I stood nearby during those celebrations, trying to convince myself that admiration was not a limited resource, though the way they overlooked my presence often suggested otherwise. As the years passed, the contrast between us became a routine my parents rarely questioned. When I completed projects or received recognition at school, their responses carried a polite softness that felt more like dismissal than encouragement. The more I tried to present my work with clarity and pride, the more obvious it became that their attention drifted elsewhere. I still remember the day I was accepted into a competitive academic program, a moment that meant everything to me, because I had earned it without shortcuts or favors. Mom congratulated me with a brief nod before turning the conversation back to Travis and his plans for business school, as though my news were a pleasant footnote rather than something that required genuine acknowledgement. During college, I devoted myself to a research project that eventually won an award from the department. I presented my findings to a panel that included faculty and industry partners, and their feedback helped me realize I was capable of building my own path without depending on anyone. When I told my parents about it, Mom smiled in a distant way, while Dad asked if Travis needed help preparing for his next venture. Moments like that forced me to accept that pride flowed in only one direction in our household, and no amount of work on my part could redirect it. When Travis launched his first restaurant, the response at home shifted from admiration to reverence. Mom spoke of him as if he were the pillar of the family, someone whose success validated all of their efforts as parents. Every expansion he made was celebrated as a triumph that set new standards for the rest of us. I supported him publicly because he was my brother, but privately, the gap between us widened until it felt like I was shouting across an empty room. Even small accomplishments of mine disappeared in the shadow of his growing brand, and Mom repeated the same sentiment so often that it eventually hardened into truth in her mind. She believed Travis carried the family, while I simply followed along without purpose. Despite everything, I kept searching for ways to show my parents that I cared about our connection. I dedicated time and energy to planning things that might bring us closer, hoping they would eventually see me for who I was, rather than who I was not. The desire to bridge the distance never left me, even when the signs pointed to how futile it was. One afternoon, my best friend Avery listened quietly as I explained my plans to surprise my parents with experiences they would remember. Avery waited until I finished before asking whether I was truly doing it for them or whether I was trying to buy the approval they had never given. The question unsettled me because it reached deeper than I expected, and I realized how often I had tried to compensate for their absence by giving more than I received. Avery reminded me that affection built on imbalance never lasts, yet I was still convinced that one meaningful effort could shift the way they saw me, even though the history between us suggested otherwise. 3 months before the trip began, I made a choice that set everything in motion. I had been searching for something meaningful to offer my family, something that might soften the distance that had grown between us over the years. Planning a stay at a Mangiri felt like the kind of gesture that could finally shift the way Mom and Dad viewed my presence in the family. I wanted an experience that carried weight, something memorable for all of us, even though I understood the risk of placing hope where history offered very little reassurance. I studied every detail the resort provided and selected a package that included the suite private transport and the type of itinerary my parents always admired in the lives of others. Paying the initial deposit required commitment, yet I felt calm while confirming the reservation because the decision came from a place of clarity rather than desperation. I wanted to give them something special not because I expected gratitude, but because I believed the moment mattered. When the confirmation email arrived, I hesitated for a long time before sharing anything with them, knowing how easily good intentions could be overshadowed by old habits. Mom learned about the trip before I had the chance to explain it properly. Instead of asking who arranged it, she told our relatives that Travis had covered the expenses, her voice carrying absolute confidence in a version of reality that suited her expectations. I heard her during a family call when she praised him for being generous and thoughtful, painting a portrait that erased my involvement. I remained silent because correcting her would have ignited a conflict I did not want to start. Allowing her to believe what she wanted felt like the simplest path at the time. Even so, a lingering disappointment settled in the back of my mind, reminding me that the narrative of our household rarely included the truth when it came from me. While I continued managing the travel arrangements, my brother Travis focused entirely on preparing a new restaurant location for its opening. He updated the family constantly, and each update reminded me why Mom found it easier to attribute the Amangiri trip to him. Travis lived in a world where achievements demanded attention, and Mom gravitated toward anything that amplified her pride. I understood that challenging her assumptions would only deepen the divide between us, yet each overlooked detail strengthened my resolve to see the trip through. I wanted to finish what I started even if no one recognized the effort. During this time, my best friend Avery checked on me more than usual. Avery knew how much careful planning meant to me and sensed the emotional cost that came with trying to give my family something valuable. One evening, after I finalized an additional payment, Avery asked whether I had prepared myself for the possibility that the trip might not change anything. I remember pausing because the question echoed thoughts I had been suppressing. My intentions were earnest, yet hope can be fragile when placed in the wrong hands. Avery reminded me that generosity loses its meaning when offered to people who refuse to see it, though Avery also understood why I struggled to step back. Despite every warning sign, I chose to continue. I completed the remaining payments and confirmed the itinerary, even adding small touches I believed my parents would enjoy. I accepted that my contribution might remain invisible to them, but I still wanted the experience to unfold as planned. When the final confirmation arrived, a quiet certainty settled within me. I realized that the trip was no longer about changing their perspective. It was about proving to myself that I could give without bending under the weight of their expectations. 3 hours before the flight was scheduled to board, I woke with a clear mind that felt strangely steady for a day that would end up splitting my life cleanly between before and after. My parents moved around the house with an energy that came from believing everything would unfold according to their expectations, while I focused on packing the last items I needed for the trip that had taken me months to prepare. My brother Travis was not coming with us that morning because he had told my parents he needed another day for meetings related to the new restaurant he planned to launch later that season. By the time my parents and I reached the airport, I had already accepted that the tension around me would hover throughout the day. At the check-in counter, the shift from impatience to open hostility happened without warning. My mom Debbie took my suitcase from my hand with a force so sharp it caused several people to look over with startled confusion. When the airline agent asked her to adjust the bag weight, she turned toward me with a face that carried more contempt than frustration. She lifted the suitcase higher than necessary and sent it crashing onto the scale while declaring that I had no place demanding special treatment, because in her words, I behaved like a parasite who only drags this family down. My dad Jensen placed a hand on her shoulder as if the gesture would soften the impact of her outburst, yet he kept his eyes on me with a distance that left no room for interpretation. His silence felt measured, as though he agreed with every word she had spoken, but preferred to let her take responsibility for delivering the blow. I felt the attention of the entire line settle on us, not with concern, but with the type of curiosity that grows in crowded places when conflict erupts. Instead of responding, I focused on maintaining a steady breath while reminding myself that reacting would only feed the narrative she had prepared long before we entered the airport. I knew that arguing with her in public would shift the attention from her behavior to mine, and she would find a way to claim that I had embarrassed the family. When the agent finished processing their tickets, my parents walked toward the security gate with a sense of triumph that suggested they believed the scene had reinforced their power. Debbie gestured for me to follow, though the gesture lacked warmth. Her voice carried a clipped tone when she told me not to delay them. Jensen did not look back. I reached the gate shortly after they did watch them join the boarding line and observed how quickly they blended into the group of passengers preparing for a relaxing vacation that I had financed quietly. Debbie stepped into the jet bridge with her chin raised, convinced that her authority remained unshaken. Jensen followed, still absorbed by his phone and unwilling to acknowledge me for even a moment. As soon as they disappeared from sight, I shifted my weight and stepped away from the gate. The decision unfolded inside me without resistance. I did not feel anger or sadness, only a calm certainty that boarding that plane would have been another act of self-betrayal. My body moved before my mind finished forming the thought, guiding me through the terminal until the noise behind me blended into a dull background hum. When the final boarding call echoed overhead, I knew that my parents had already settled into their seats, confident that I would eventually fall back into the pattern they expected. They did not know that I had already turned off the path they believed I would follow forever. I walked toward the exit with a sense of clarity that had taken years to surface, ready for the moment their plane touched down and the cost of their choices returned to them in a way none of them had imagined. 2 hours after the plane left the runway, I remained in the same quiet corner of the terminal, letting the last traces of tension settle as I focused on the screen of my phone. The gate area had emptied, giving me enough space to think clearly while reviewing the details of the trip I had spent months arranging. The Amangiri app loaded slowly, yet once it opened, I saw my name attached to every reservation without exception. The suite, the private transport, the guided excursions, the spa sessions, and the dining arrangements all reflected my payment information, confirming that not a single part of the trip had ever involved my parents or my brother. I moved to a nearby seating area, found a spot far from foot traffic, and scrolled through the confirmation pages to ensure there were no shared authorizations that could complicate the next steps. The app displayed the deposit figures I remembered from the day I finalized the booking, and the numbers settled my suspicions that nothing had changed since those nights I spent planning the perfect retreat for them. Once I confirmed that every charge was processed exclusively under my account, I pressed the support icon and waited for the call to connect. A calm voice answered, introducing herself as Caroline, the reservations specialist assigned to my booking. I explained that I needed to cancel the entire itinerary, including the suite, and every scheduled activity. Caroline asked for verification, then paused as the system updated. She confirmed the cancellation policy outlined the timeline for releasing the suite and noted that the resort normally required a longer notice period. After reviewing the payment history, she informed me that my status allowed for a credit rollover that could be used later in the season. I approved the transfer and instructed her to apply the full amount toward a future solo stay that would take place once I determined a date. Caroline completed the process with a steadiness that matched the clarity I felt while listening to her type. After ending the call, I reached for my bag and opened the document folder where I kept every financial statement connected to the trip. The printed receipts reassured me that the funds used came entirely from my work, leaving no room for dispute from my parents if they attempted to twist the narrative. Still, I understood that my decision might escalate into something larger once they reached the resort, which meant I needed legal confirmation before taking another step. I dialed the number of my lawyer Dalton, who had represented me during several past situations that required a calm mind and strategic instinct. When Dalton picked up, his tone conveyed controlled curiosity rather than concern. I summarized the events at the airport and detailed the financial structure of the trip, making sure to explain that everything had been processed through my account alone. Dalton asked a series of precise questions regarding authorization documentation and potential claims from my parents. He listened carefully and identified the clauses that safeguarded my actions. He confirmed that I held the full right to cancel the trip, emphasized that the credit rollover was valid under the resort's policy, and reminded me that no one else could dispute charges they had never paid for. His clarity steadied me, validating that the step I had taken carried no legal risk. Once our call ended, I closed my folder and placed it back in my bag. The decision to begin my own journey did not require dramatic gestures, only the quiet acknowledgement that I had stepped out of a pattern that no longer supported me. I walked toward the exit past groups of travelers moving with purpose and felt a sense of direction stronger than anything I had experienced during the months leading up to the trip. My path no longer aligned with the expectations that had shaped my entire life, and with each step away from the terminal, the weight of that realization made the air around me feel lighter. 4 hours after their plane touched down in Utah, the first fracture in their expectations surfaced the moment they stepped inside the Amangiri reception hall. I learned the sequence of events later through the fragments of calls they attempted to push onto me, yet the details followed such a predictable pattern that I could picture every expression playing across their faces. My mom, Debbie, approached the front desk with the level of confidence she reserved for moments when she believed the world existed to accommodate her. My dad, Jensen, stood slightly behind her, carrying an attitude shaped by the false certainty that everything remained under their control. The receptionist asked for the reservation name, and my mom offered her own with the same tone she used to present herself at charity gatherings. When the receptionist typed a few entries into the system, the confusion that crossed her face carried none of the performative politeness my mom expected. The receptionist repeated the question, clarifying that no booking existed under Debbie's information. My mom insisted that the suite had been arranged weeks ago, explained that she had confirmed everything with Travis, and told the receptionist to check again using my dad's name. The results did not change. As the tension built, the receptionist requested a payment method to verify any linked reservations. My mom handed over her card with a strained smile, believing that the issue came from a simple search error. When the card failed to process, the smile hardened. She dismissed the decline as a temporary glitch and motioned for my dad to offer his. Jensen complied, yet his attempts produced the same result. The receptionist maintained a level tone while explaining that no active reservation existed for their family and that all suites for the evening had been booked by other guests. My mom stepped aside with a rigid posture and called Travis, believing he would resolve the situation with the ease she associated with every achievement she credited to him. Travis answered with a voice that carried exhaustion rather than authority. He explained that he could not pay for a 5-day luxury stay on such short notice because the funds he had were tied to payroll and the restaurant expansion he claimed would elevate the family's reputation. My mom insisted that he cover the cost until she returned to Nevada, yet Travis repeated that the amount exceeded what he could access without jeopardizing obligations he claimed he could not postpone. The call ended with my mom whispering to my dad that Travis must be hiding something. With no booking, no payment method, and no available rooms, my parents attempted to negotiate for a solution that did not exist. Their frustration escalated into a tense conversation with the receptionist that ended once the staff member explained that the nearest alternative lodging required significant travel and carried no guarantee of vacancy. My parents gathered their luggage with movements shaped by disbelief rather than acceptance. The trip they had envisioned as an effortless display of superiority dissolved before they even stepped outside the resort lobby. As they left the property, Debbie began calling me. The first calls came within minutes, followed by several more in rapid succession. Each call displayed her number with a frequency that revealed the desperation building beneath her anger. I watched the calls appear on my screen while seated in a quiet lounge far from the main resort areas, yet I chose not to answer. I had no intention of offering explanations or comfort, nor did I feel the need to defend my decision. While their panic escalated, I prepared to check into the private section of the resort reserved for guests who booked specific package tiers. A staff member scanned my confirmation and welcomed me with a professionalism that contrasted sharply with the last interaction I had witnessed at the airport. As I followed the attendant into the quiet wing reserved for higher-tier guests, the only sound interrupting the calm came from my phone, vibrating with another call from my mom. I silenced the device, stepped deeper into the lounge reserved for arrivals of my status, and allowed myself to feel the steadiness that came from choosing a path no one in my family believed I would ever take. The next morning arrived with a brightness that felt almost indifferent to everything unfolding behind the scenes. I woke to a notification from my bank confirming the successful refunds from the cancellations I had initiated, and the quiet confirmation steadied me as I prepared for breakfast. Everything else that followed moved with a momentum I had not predicted but could no longer stop. A message from my mother appeared first, long and frantic, demanding explanations for what she called the most humiliating moment of her life. I ignored it and opened the folder on my phone where I stored every receipt confirmation and email associated with the trip. I forwarded the entire collection to the family group thread without any commentary. The silence that followed told me they finally understood I had paid for everything. My brother Travis responded after several minutes with a single sentence claiming he had intended to reimburse me after the vacation. His tone shifted once he realized the depth of exposure he faced, and I sensed his panic even through the screen. I sent nothing back. My mother sent another message filled with accusations, each one framed as if I had betrayed her generosity. I muted the thread and placed the phone face down. The act felt like closing a door I should have shut years ago. An hour later, the first headline appeared. The article focused on my brother identifying his restaurant group as the subject of an investigation related to misreported revenue missing payroll taxes and two outstanding vendor disputes. I read the details carefully. The background of the story revealed that the financial stress had escalated during the expansion project he insisted on launching earlier that year. I remembered the moment he had boasted about opening the new location. His confidence had sounded rehearsed and brittle. Another headline followed before I could process the first one. This time, the report described the reaction of Violet, the owner of the flagship location, who had attempted to reassure her staff and the local community. The article included a photograph of her leaving a meeting surrounded by reporters. Her expression reflected a mixture of anger and exhaustion. The caption explained that she had been blindsided by unpaid invoices that had accumulated under Travis's leadership. Within minutes, a statement from my father's company surfaced online. The post attempted to portray stability, yet the comment section questioned every line. Anonymous employees referenced irregular payroll schedules. A local business journal then announced that the company had been selected for a comprehensive tax audit. I read each update with a detached clarity that surprised me. A message from my mother attempted a different tactic, claiming the crisis could have been prevented if I had supported the family rather than distancing myself. I deleted it without hesitation. My father attempted to call, but I declined twice until the phone finally stopped vibrating. Meanwhile, a third article criticized the management decisions behind the expansion project. Violet had apparently confronted my brother in a private meeting that later became public. Her frustration became a focal point for the investigation, and several employees were quoted describing the chaos created by his decisions. From the balcony of my suite, I watched the desert light stretch across the red sandstone cliffs. The landscape felt distant from everything unraveling in my hometown, yet it grounded me in a way that made each headline feel like a distant echo. I understood I could not rescue any of them from the consequences they had created, and the realization no longer frightened me. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to observe without intervening. Every message from my family went unanswered. Every headline spoke for itself. The world kept moving, and I allowed it to move without pulling me back into the shadows I had lived in for far too long. 1 week later felt like an invisible line between the life I had tolerated for years and the life I finally allowed myself to claim. I woke to a string of notifications that illuminated every consequence unfolding within the world my family had tried to shield from accountability. Suppliers who once competed for a place in my dad's monthly contracts withdrew without hesitation after learning the scale of the financial discrepancies that their teams had uncovered in recent reviews. Their messages were direct and unbothered, and each one severed a chain my parents believed could never be cut. My phone continued vibrating as I prepared breakfast. A message from a sous chef who had worked under my brother Travis appeared at the top of the screen, followed by another from a server who had endured the same dismissive culture that my mother Debbie proudly encouraged, as if she were defending a dynasty rather than a workplace. Both messages explained that they had resigned because the situation inside the restaurant had grown chaotic after the revelations that followed the Amangiri incident. Their descriptions painted a picture of a place collapsing under the weight of its own entitlement. Customers who once filled every table began canceling reservations after hearing whispers of unpaid invoices and inconsistent reports. Even loyal patrons turned away when their meals arrived late or arrived cold due to the staff shortage. I stepped onto my balcony and allowed the sunlight to settle across my face. For the first time in a long time, I felt no urgency to intervene in a crisis created by the people who had dismissed every boundary I attempted to set. My phone rang again, and this time the caller ID displayed the name of the one person I knew would only reach out when desperation outweighed pride. My dad had been avoiding me since the day at the airport, yet there he was, calling repeatedly, as if the repetition itself would erase what he had ignored for years. When I finally answered, the exhaustion in his voice bled through the silence before he spoke. Fallon, everything is falling apart. The suppliers are gone, the customers are gone, and we cannot manage this without help. His breathing grew uneven, and I heard papers shuffling as though he were searching for words that could anchor him. He had never spoken to me in a tone that revealed vulnerability, which made the shift strangely heavy rather than satisfying. I leaned against the railing, allowing the breeze to settle me before responding. Dad, I understand that you are overwhelmed, but I cannot fix what I did not break. The words felt like releasing a breath I had been holding for years. I spent so much time trying to earn a place that never existed for me. I will not carry the consequences of choices I never made. He whispered my name, and his voice cracked in a way that almost pulled at old wounds. Please, Fallon, just tell me what to do. For a moment, I closed my eyes and let the years of being overlooked settle into one steady truth. I'm done. The sentence carried a softness that came from pain rather than anger. It was not shouted or spat out. It was a farewell shaped by years of effort that received nothing in return. I ended the call before he replied, not out of cruelty, but out of a promise I made to myself the moment I watched my luggage hit the airport floor. I spent the rest of the afternoon packing boxes in my apartment. Each folded sweater and wrapped frame felt like a quiet confirmation that stepping away from their world was not an act of abandonment, but an act of survival. I arranged for a moving service to deliver my belongings to a small home I had purchased several miles outside the city. It was a place filled with light, quiet corners and rooms untainted by expectations I could never satisfy. When I closed the door behind me for the final time, the echo in my chest was not loss. It was relief. I walked forward without looking back, and every step felt like a truth I had waited too long to claim. They no longer had access to me. I no longer waited for them to see me. That era of my life was finished, and I allowed it to stay behind me. Family can shape us, but it should never define the limits of our worth. I learned that loyalty without boundaries only teaches people to take more than they ever give. The moment we decide to protect our dignity, we stop accepting roles built on silence and sacrifice. Saying enough is not cruelty. It is clarity. When we choose our well-being over expectations that have crushed us for years, we finally discover the freedom of living on our own terms. Thank you for staying with me until the final chapter of this story. Your time and presence mean more than you know, and I hope the journey reminded you that your voice matters. If this experience made you reflect on boundaries, self-respect, or family expectations, I would love to hear your thoughts. Share your perspective in the comments and join the conversation. Your story matters too.